So we're going to transition to our sixth session, which is on building effective DEIA plans. As we've mentioned previously, there is no requirement or section in the BA that says you have to specify a plan. We expect that this will be a critical component that's embedded throughout the engine. And so at this point, I'm going to bring in Becky and Manya Ruffin, who are going to talk about DEIA and provide some additional insights on how this might be done effectively in an engine.
As Dimitri just mentioned, we talk a lot about DEIA as being something that's integral to an engine, and it should be really sort of embedded throughout the engine. I wanted, if we go to the next slide, I wanted to just highlight before we get started where we do call it out in a few places in the BAA, just to kind of give you some specific parts of the proposal to be thinking about. As you read the BAA, you'll see that we do include it as a specific objective of the engine, right, to embody a culture of DEIA throughout your engine's leadership and activities. We then emphasize that same language. We mirror that same language in the review criterion on DEIA. We didn't discuss it in the last session, but it is just as important as all the others. But then if you read through the BAA, you will see specific reference to DEIA in things like your management plan, in your strategic plan, in your evaluation plan, which we also didn't touch on much in the last session, but will be central to an engine and to the success of an engine, really. So I just wanted to highlight, it really is embedded throughout the BAA and should be embedded throughout your proposal and therefore throughout your engine and innovation ecosystem. So I'm very excited that for this session, we have Dr. Manya Ruffin-Nash joining us. She's the Acting Deputy Division Director for the Division of Research on Learning in Formal and Informal Settings in the Directorate for Education and Human Resources at NSF. She has dedicated her 25-year professional career to promoting STEM, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. And she's been at NSF for 11 years now, where she has served in many leadership roles across the agency, advancing DEIA efforts in many different areas at NSF. And so with that, I am super excited to be able to invite Manya to join me. She's going to give a very brief presentation on DEIA and impactful plans. And then we're going to have a little bit of a conversation to dig into this in more detail. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Manya.
Sounds great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Becky. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to come and speak with everybody about DEIA and really about developing impactful and effective DEIA plans. So I'll just say a couple of words here just to start us off, and then we'll get into the discussion. So first, I just want to note, and I know that you all are aware, but just want to underscore that a diverse and capable workforce really is vital to maintaining the nation's standard of excellence in STEM. Of course, that's science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. I want to note that the National Science Foundation is committed, as you probably heard throughout the day, but we really are committed to expanding opportunities in STEM, particularly to people of all racial and ethnic backgrounds, geographic and socioeconomic backgrounds, sexual orientations, gender identities, and to persons with disabilities, as well as many others. This commitment is reflected in the NSF mission, the core values, our strategic plan, and throughout the agency, and efforts that are supported by the National Science Foundation. And similarly, for the Engines program, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, or DEIA, should be intentionally and meaningfully embedded at all levels within intellectual merit and broader impacts, which I'll say a little bit more about in a second, but it should be embedded and within both the work, the leadership, the research and development, and workforce development, which based on the last session, you all have had quite the discussion about what workforce development means, and especially within the engine framework. Thanks, I heard some really good comments there. So impactful DEI plans really should carefully consider each aspect of DEIA. It's become a little bit of a catchphrase right now, and people sometimes see it as a single solid construct. But in fact, DEIA they are independent ideas and should be considered that way, as well as deeply connected and integral to each other, from project conceptualization to implementation to evaluation and reporting, which we'll talk a little bit more about. So very quickly, I want to give you a few definitions of consideration for how to think about diversity, right? So diversity is the inclusion of a broad range of perspective, backgrounds, talents, and voices of individuals and communities, promoting the ingenuity and creativity needed to advance STEM. Now, when we think about equity, we really think about it really focuses, in fact, on fairness and justice, and recognizes that each person has different circumstances. It acknowledges and requires resources and opportunities to address the imbalances to achieve comparable outcomes. Inclusion, of course, compromises, it does not, hopefully. It comprises behaviors, practices, and also policies to provide equal access and opportunities to individuals who may otherwise be excluded, such as some of the groups that I mentioned before, those that are underrepresented in STEM. And then finally, accessibility. And we often hear this term in different ways. So I will define it here for us as involving reducing barriers and obstacles for individuals. We also often hear this term in reference to persons with disabilities, but it's not limited to persons with disabilities. We're really interested in providing for equal opportunities to gain knowledge, to interact with others, to receive opportunities and resources, okay? All right, so very quickly, I'll just say a few words here and then we'll get to our discussion that we're going to have here today. So if we take a look here, it talks about implementing impactful DEI plans. And on this slide, there are a couple of considerations, especially for the Engines program. And that is just really important to consider DEIA. And this is from the lens of both intellectual merit and broader impacts, which I know that you all know is very important for NSF. Now for the Engine program, of course, both of these areas should be an embedded approach, intellectual merit and broader impacts. Now, a few DEI considerations for intellectual merit, which is really about the potential to advance knowledge, are here. So for instance, if we take a look at the first one where it mentions, is the proposal and project conceptualization and implementation team diverse across multiple variables? Now, we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but I just want to underscore how important it is to include a diverse team from project conceptualization through implementation. A lot of times people think of DEIA as a broader impact type of activity or engagement or focus, but in fact, it's really important as part of the intellectual merit. Okay, I'll pick a couple of more here. I know that you can see them all, but I'll move around. Let's take a look at a little bit further down. It talks about to what extent does the project design methods and anticipated deliverables support equity? Again, another place where it's really important to look across the entire project, the entire engine work that you are planning for equity. That's that embedded approach. Let's look at the broader impacts. And then when we think about broader impacts, that's really about the potential to benefit society and contribute to the achievement of specific or desired societal outcomes. Again, several questions here to consider as you're developing your impactful DEI plan. I point you to the first one, which is about how well does the proposed activity engage and benefit the diverse group of individuals. So it goes a little bit beyond the intellectual merit in some ways that is actually expanding that thought into how those individuals are actually benefiting, being impacted by the work that's being proposed. If we look further down, I'll skip to the third one, which is really, although the second one is one of my favorites, so do take a look at it as well. But we look at the third one, it talks about the assessment. What assessment and evaluative activities, so important, will be implemented to assess the extent to which the project, the dissemination practices, and the broader impacts have been equitable and inclusive. And I'm highlighting this one for us before we move to the next piece, because oftentimes when we're thinking about research and project design, evaluation and assessment is often seen within the context of the content, like the scientific discipline or the project. Was it effective? Did people attend? Those kinds of variables, but people don't always really think and really think about equity and inclusion as really important assessment measures to really look at the impact of the work. Okay, so this one is also really, really important for developing an impactful DEI plan. Now, these are the two review criteria that proposal reviewers, and I've heard from your mock panel, you've now heard a lot about what proposal reviewers will be doing. So they will be looking at these review criteria, and they're very important. And they will use these to evaluate the strength and competitiveness of your engine proposal. And in particular, your DEIA plan. Now, the first review criteria aligns with the statement that I made early in the presentation. And it's about, and I'm going to reiterate it. It's about diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, and about it being intentionally and meaningfully embedded at all levels. And that is really what this review criteria is, or criterion is getting at. If we look at the second criterion, you can see that it can be addressed the same way. But I would also add that with clearly stated DEI goals and metrics, they should be realistic and measurable. And again, this is an area where a DEIA evaluator or researcher or expert in this area may be helpful. Metrics should go beyond seat counting and participation counting, okay? They really should seek to better identify and understand areas of DEI impact, which is what I mentioned just before. Both the negative and the positive, because they all give really important, profound, not profound necessarily, but really important information to us about impact. And that information could have a profound impact, not only on the individuals and community served, but also on STEM fields and DEI related efforts and research more broadly. Okay, so those were my quick few words. And now I will turn it back over to Becky so we can unpack some of what I've just mentioned to you.
Fantastic.
Yes.
And I just want to take a pause and just mention to our audience. So Manya referred to DEIA plans. There isn't a specific call in the BAA for a specific plan the way we ask for a management plan, for example, but we do expect you to be addressing in your narrative how you will ensure and implement DEIA throughout your engine. So I just wanted to make sure people aren't, shuffling through the BAA looking for that plan.
Thanks,
so
Becky.
I have 3 questions for you, Manya. So hopefully with our time remaining, we can get through them because I am really interested in hearing your thoughts on them. So to start out, as someone who has extensive experience, not only in diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, but also with large multi-organizational cross-sector ecosystems, I'm really curious about what a diverse and inclusive innovation ecosystem would look like to you. You know, so what do you think you would be able to observe in that ecosystem that would indicate that it was truly inclusive, equitable, accessible?
Great question. Happy to respond. And I will say that in addition to all of the other areas, I'm a biologist as well. So my scientific discipline is actually in biology. So I've thought about ecosystems for quite some time. And I will say that when we think about an ecosystem, ecosystems really include many different aspects of a system. We would say the living and the non-living aspects of a ecosystem. Now, in terms of DEIA, that ecosystem really should include, should include embedded DEIA. So we would see examples of diversity, equity, inclusion, and access. They would be prioritized. They would be considered in all aspects. So as I mentioned before, from conceptualization to the leadership, the partnerships and collaborations that are part of it, I think all of that would be very important for a thriving and healthy ecosystem. One of the other things that I would mention is that it's really important to consider the dynamics. Ecosystems are viable, they're living, there are always changes, there can be threats. In the DEIA world, that could potentially be how we consider power and privilege of who's involved. That could be that from an institutional perspective. It could also be from an individual perspective. And I think that a really healthy ecosystem, you would see and hear language that is actively considering the role and the engagement and the way that different individuals contribute their time and their talents. So those are some of the kinds of aspects I would expect to see in an inclusive ecosystem.
Yeah, I love that mention about sort of that it's got to be always present. You never know when there will be threats to it, right? It's not something that you can set free at the beginning and just think, okay, now we've done it, we don't have to worry about it, right? But you have to be very intentional continually in that ecosystem. I think maybe feeding off of that, you know, to think about how would we do this? How can a team who's building an engine build one that is not just diverse, but establishes and maintains the policies, the structures and practices long-term so that inclusivity is really maintained, right? How can, when we say embed, right, what are those sort of more systemic things that we may see or want to be thinking about to do that?
Well, I think intentionality is going to be really important. I think, and that's from the very beginning with teams, even in who you hire and how you hire your teams. I think it's really important to, and I made some notes here, make sure that the team considers language. So there'll be, you know, inclusive language. One of the areas that we often see in the literature is around microaggressions and other kinds of language that can be very excluding to individuals and communities, groups of individuals. And so a team that really wants to be sustained longer term, I think will have, they'll be aware you know, or actively checking in with themselves to make sure that they are, in fact, even using language in policy and meetings and as a team that really invites and promotes belonging and inclusiveness. Yeah. Some groups also have group norms. So there are teams that really do spend time, especially in retreats or other, you know, meeting environments, to think through how they want to engage with each other in a way that is inclusive and welcoming and inviting, but also really does kind of integrate contributions. It's not just about listening to contributions, but it's actually taking up some of what one is hearing, those insights, and actually putting them into action. So I think that is also important, having those group norms and having them established, and often having them written down so that when new members join the team as part of their onboarding, if you will, is for them to actually be introduced to the group norms. And then that way they're also learning about the dynamics and what's really important to the team. The other piece that I would mention is that it's important. So expertise is also really important. So having people who are on the team who can help both with internal dynamics, but also external dynamics. They're also helping with the actual work from conceptualization. So it's not an add-on. It's not, I want to do diversity, so I've written a proposal, let me reach out to the closest MSI because they work with those people, kind of a thing. That is not what we mean by embedded DEIA. That's why I mentioned from the very beginning, from the conceptualization.
And I would imagine those experts, right? Because there is expertise in this. This is not just, oh yeah, I want to include everybody. I like everybody. I don't, there is definite expertise in this. The visibility of that expert, I would imagine, is also important in the engine in terms of the position they are in within the engine. Would you agree?
I would absolutely agree. And I can't say it enough. And I'm surprised I didn't mention this earlier because I've been in one of those positions where the team really wanted to elevate and make visible the importance of diversity by having someone on the team in a leadership position, a leadership officer who worked on and with the team on diversity and equity related efforts. So that's one piece. I think definitely considering a diversity officer or someone in a leadership position, a position of influence, frankly, I think is really important. I've also heard, what is it? Equity, there's an equity, what is that word that's used sometimes?
The equity anchor.
That's it, the anchor. I was trying to remember. Thank you, Becky. Because that is taking off. I mean, it's definitely getting some traction. That oftentimes in meetings, there'll be an equity anchor where there's someone in the meeting who their role is to kind of make sure that the group is really considering equity in the conversation and in the work that's being proposed, et cetera. What's interesting about that anchor is that that person can change, and that person doesn't have to be an expert. It can just be their role is to kind of help monitor, but also kind of support the goals of an engine, for instance. It could be your engine project to kind of keep DEIA work front and center. So definitely, I completely agree. I think having someone on the team who either is in that anchor position or is a expert, because no one is expected to be an expert in everything. And as you said, there are people who have expertise in this area, just like there are organizations that really do have expertise in this area.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
Can I
so,
add one more thing?
okay, I do want to ask one more question though.
Sure.
Before we leave, but you.
Okay, I'll just add this one other thing, and it was also around evaluation, because I mentioned it earlier and how important evidence of success is for your projects, not only to understand your current work, but especially if you build on your work, it's important to know whether or not it was successful and from the DEIA lens. So I would just want to underscore that there are evaluators out there who have DEIA expertise as well.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay.
So the last thing I want to touch on, we've mentioned a little bit now that you really have to be intentional. It's going to, you know, things will change over time if you're not being intentional. And so that brings me to this last idea. We do want our teams to establish a culture of DEIA throughout the engine and the ecosystem. And so what is we kind of touched on this, but, you know, presumably the mindset of the lead organization really has to be focused on this. But what I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on is how would that leadership team ensure that they're propagating this culture of DEIA, particularly as they're bringing on new partners over the course of 10 years? You know, making sure that onboarding process is they're keeping the DEIA piece central there. Can you speak to that kind of the importance of leadership in that space and propagating this culture?
Right. I think that's an excellent question. And I'll say first is that the leadership team needs to reflect the DEIA kind of principles, practices, and work. It really, I mean, if there's a serious commitment to diversity, for instance, then it would be good to see diversity in the leadership team. So just in terms of just modeling what that means, and there are many different variables. There's even intersectionality around what that means. Okay, so I think that is a first step in terms of modeling. I mentioned the norms, but I think having in writing, there are groups that will actually develop a kind of diversity statement. They incorporate it in their mission and their vision. Some of them will have, so while there may not be a requirement for an actual DEIA plan for engineering, their engineering engines, there should be a plan for DEIA that the leadership team constantly revisits and constantly reinforces. And I think that's really important. I mentioned the hiring, and then finally, I would just go back to the whole onboarding, making sure new people are on board, and also that there is always opportunities for training together and thinking through these challenges, but also just topics together. And it can be a really great bonding opportunity as well around very, very important issues and challenges. But also, I will say opportunities, because this really is about the positive, the asset building contributions of those in the DEIA space, and that's everybody. So absolutely, there we are.
Thank you so much. And the last thing I just want to highlight for our audience, so these are regional innovation engines to drive a regional ecosystem. And so you made a brief mention, right? We don't want to see at the last minute to bring on a MSI, for example. I think an extension of that, you know, if your region is, you know, in New England, or your region is in the Pacific Northwest, where there aren't many HBCUs, right? We wouldn't expect you to be reaching out necessarily to HBCUs, right? There's an element of this that we want to reflect your community.
Absolutely.
Would you agree there? Yeah.
I would agree. Though I will say that there are, for instance, if we speak to MSIs, there are MSIs that really have great expertise in certain areas, right? And so from a content perspective and also a DEI perspective, it could be that that expertise is brought in, even if it's in an advisory capacity. So I would say that there could be circumstances where it absolutely may be important to bring in additional expertise.
Absolutely. That I love that idea, right? If the expertise resides there, you bring them in. But you're not doing that and demonstrating that you're speaking to your region.
For
right?
sure.
It's a both and.
For sure. Absolutely agree. 100%. Yeah. For sure.
All right. Well, we are over time, which I think we both knew we would do. I can't thank you enough, Manya, for participating today. It was great to get your thoughts and perspective. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Dimitri.
Thanks for having me.